Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this regular meeting of the Education and Neighborhoods Committee for Wednesday, November 10th, 2010. It is 3:37, and I'm joined by the always dapper, honorable council member Dennis Zine. Welcome, Mr. Zine.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, let me explain why I look so dapper this afternoon is that I'm a member of the United States Army Advisory Board. We had a mission to accomplish, and this is why I'm in this attire instead of my suit. Mission was accomplished, and we're safe and secure.
Bravo. I feel more secure, and now we're off to our next series of missions this afternoon,
Yes,
so we're glad you're here to join us for it. Thank you. We'll be taking general public comment after the one and only item on the agenda, if there is separate public comment, and I see that there is. So let's proceed to item number one. Mr. Powell.
Thank you. Communications from the city clerk and the city attorney relative to an after-action report for the 2010 Neighborhood Council Board elections and recommendations for administration of future Neighborhood Council elections.
All right, thank you. Who will be speaking on behalf of the city clerk? Oh, I'm sorry. Ms. Lagme, I'm so sorry. I didn't see you back there. Come right on up. So welcome. We are continuing our discussion about the neighborhood council elections and the after-action report that your office has prepared, for which I thank you. And also possible recommendations that we may have for future action with regard to the governance and conduct of elections. So if we could, we have your report. Thank you. I would appreciate if you could give a brief overview of what happened during this last cycle of elections. What were the positive elements of it from your perspective? Maybe what were the not so positive elements, general statistical overview, and then we can talk about some future steps and recommendations that might flow from that.
Understood. Thank you very much, Mr. Krikorian and Mr. Zine. As you know, you had instructed us that upon the conclusion of the 2010 Neighborhood Council election cycle, that we should provide a comprehensive after-action report, which is before you. And it is comprised of four basic areas. It reviews how we planned and administered that election cycle, including the statistical results and the feedback. We also tried to be honest about certain issues which arose during the election process, both positive and negative, that need to be worked on, as identified by our own office, by the Board of Neighborhood Neighborhood Commissioners, and the neighborhood councils themselves. A quick cost analysis of what the 2010 Neighborhood Council election cycle actually cost us, and some options for conducting neighborhood council elections in the future, whether they go back to the neighborhood councils or done, whether the clerk does them again, whether the clerk does them in a different, reimagined way. This is all good stuff for discussion. So I just wanted to thank you, and we have a lot of stuff to go through. I have full confidence in my staff member, Izzy Cantu, who will touch upon some of the major portions of the planning section, the issues which arose, the cost analysis, and then we'll discuss the options for the future altogether.
Great. Thank you.
Good evening, commissioners. Councilman. My name is Isaias Cantu. I'm the Senior Project Coordinator for the Office of the City Clerk Election Division. 2010 was the first full implementation of all of the neighborhood council elections. It was quite an undertaking, and one that was both educational and, we believe, successful. The City Clerk, in collaboration with the Neighborhood Council Election Development Group, developed over a period of many months the processes, policies, and procedures that it used to implement the 90 neighborhood council elections. The uniform procedures were developed in accordance with the Ordinance 179-680 as passed by City Council and the 912 Commission's recommendations 44, 47, and 53. While these procedures did establish general procedures, they respected each neighborhood council's unique board structure, candidate, and voter qualifications, amongst other things. the city clerk created documents that were to be used by the neighborhood councils to further specify key election issues that might not be included in their bylaws, such as minimum voting age, vacancy clause, polling place selection, and map and district boundaries. Where the NC did not submit these documents, the city clerk, in collaboration with the Neighborhood Council Election Development Group, adopted default values that would be incorporated into a neighborhood council's election procedures in the absence of the documents from the neighborhood council or specificity in the neighborhood council's bylaws. These default values were used for 8 neighborhood councils, although the majority of these neighborhood councils agreed to the values and consciously decided to accept them by default. The city clerk recruited 90 neighborhood council polling places, the overwhelming majority of them at no cost to the city of Los Angeles. We have found that there is room for improving this process and in the future providing an option for the neighborhood councils to choose to pay for their own selected polling place. Assuming, of course, that the location is suitable, and by suitable we need ADA compliant. For the 2010 neighborhood council elections, the city clerk created materials such as ballots, maps, signage, and many other election-related forms and documents. Of special note was the development of the ballot development database that linked the candidate filing, ballot creation, and tally processes into one streamlined process. This process was developed by the city clerk's systems personnel and is used with the scanning hardware purchased by the city clerk to tally ballots, create ballots, and create lists of candidates for posting on the web.
I'm sorry, was that purchase made specifically for neighborhood council elections?
Correct.
Okay. And that hardware and software that was purchased and developed is still available for future elections?
Correct.
Okay.
If I'm not incorrect, that's an example of a one-time cost that will never need to be repeated.
Correct.
Okay.
All right. In total, that one-time expense was approximately $103,670.27. During the 2010 neighborhood council elections, a total of 21,623 persons voted for the 1,580 open NC board member seats. Running for those seats were 1,423 candidates appearing on the ballot and 246 write-in candidates for a total of 1,669 candidates. The city clerk produced 361 unique ballot types. Although the majority of these neighborhood councils did have one ballot type, some required as many as 21 different ballot types for their elections. We had a total of 37 stakeholders express an interest in volunteering to be a poll worker. However, only 15 actually attended the training and served as a volunteer. 11 of the original 37 canceled or did not show up on election day. 6 were disqualified from working their own NC because they were either candidates or related to candidates. And these volunteers declined to work in any other neighborhood council when they were provided the opportunity to do so. The challenge review panel heard 13 of 22 submitted challenges. All these challenges were resolved without the need to hold a recount or redo an election. Because election challenge applications quite often contain multiple challenges, the city clerk reviewed each submitted challenge for content and considered each contained challenge on its own individual merit. Challenges that did not contain a challengeable issue or that contained issues outside the scope of the authority of the city clerk were set aside in accordance with City Clerk Election Division Policy Number 29.
And I'm sorry, on those, are you talking about challenges as to eligibility of candidates or challenges as to eligibility of voters or both?
In this, we're talking about challenges to, for example, the selection of a polling place, the challenges towards the selection of a neighborhood council as to how stakeholders would be considered eligible.
Mm-hmm.
For example, a neighborhood council would select self-affirmation, and
Right.
someone would challenge that it should have been documentation required. That's not a challengeable issue because
I
that
see.
issue is outside of the decision-making scope of the city clerk.
Okay.
Where only a portion of the challenge involved challengeable issues, that specific challenge was presented to the challenge review panel, and all other non-challengeable portions were set aside. This was the case for 9 challenges that were not processed by the city clerk that contained non-challengeable issues such as how candidate forms are administered, the participation of volunteer poll workers, or stakeholder eligibility in a self-affirmation election. And issues out of the city clerk's scope of authority, such as alleged voter intimidation and threats prior to Election Day, or issues related to unapproved bylaw amendments. Upon completion of the 2010 Neighborhood Council elections, and in order to compile feedback regarding our implementation of those elections, the city clerk distributed truth surveys to 2 different pools of recipients. The Election Day survey collected data from 3,919 of the stakeholders who voted on Election Day on the days of those elections. The listserv survey collected data from 162 of the 985 persons on our listserv. 87% of those respondents were candidates for the Neighborhood Council elections. On a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 is the best, the Election Day survey resulted in an average rating of 7.8 by stakeholders. Voters described polling place staff as organized, professional, and helpful. The voting process was described as quick and efficient. However, voters expressed concerns about aggressive campaign tactics. Principally, there seems to be concerns about what should be defined as electioneering. During municipal elections, electioneering is considered campaigning within 100 feet of the door to the entrance to the room in which voting is taking place. Activities outside the 100 feet are considered campaigning and are permissible. However, based on the challenges we received and feedback from neighborhood councils, it is possible that the definition of electioneering as it pertains to neighborhood councils may need to be revisited for the 2012 NC election cycle. Finally, during the 4 post-election regional feedback meetings conducted by the city clerk, we received the following concerns. Generally, these were concerns regarding outreach, the vote-by-mail process, and the factual basis stakeholder status. Participants expressed satisfaction with the communication process between the city clerk and the NCs. However, there was a great deal of concern regarding the challenge process. Stakeholders wanted access to the meetings, and challengers wanted the ability to be able to provide testimony. The challenge process was developed by the city clerk based on the process that had been previously used by Dunn, which had never provided for an open setting for challenges to be heard. The city clerk then married this process with the need to protect the panelists from being pressured into making decisions. This issue should be revisited and discussed with NCs should the city clerk be asked to implement the 2012 NC elections. The city clerk developed a standardized election process that was based on the same model that had been previously used at Department of Neighborhood Empowerment. The citywide election procedures for neighborhood council elections, the document used as the basis for our own structure, was developed over the course of a year by the neighborhood councils and the previous city clerk, Frank Martinez. The citywide election procedures for neighborhood council elections were adopted by city council and contained a great deal of the standardization prior to the city clerk being directed to implement the neighborhood council elections. The differences would be more nuts and bolts issues such as how candidates are certified and procedural deadlines. Based on the feedback from neighborhood councils and our own experience, the city clerk would recommend that in the future, neighborhood council election days be prevented from coinciding with regular city or state election days, and would suggest exploring how to adjust the process and provide a flexible means by which to make sensible accommodations for neighborhood councils with religious groups like the Orthodox Jewish community in Greater Wilshire, or extremely large stakeholder groups like USC students in Empowerment Congress or workers in downtown Los Angeles Neighborhood Council, who could be disenfranchised by the selection of certain election days of the week. During the implementation of the 2010 NC elections, the city clerk did find some issues with 3 key items. These were, 1, the need for more election outreach, 2, the need for more comprehensive vote by mail, and 3, the difficulty in defining factual basis stakeholder status. Our report contains suggestions to consider for future NC elections. I believe some of these issues are already being addressed by the Board of Neighborhood Commissioners and the Neighborhood Councils, and for that, we commend both of these for their proactive work. In regards to the election costs, as requested by the members of the Education and Neighborhoods Committee, the City Clerk has come up with the amount spent for the 2010 Neighborhood Council elections. Of the budgeted $1.9 million it was provided, the City Clerk used $1,147,476.98. Thanks to cost-saving measures, the City Clerk was able to return 39.8% of the budget it was provided. These funds reverted to the reserve fund at the end of the last fiscal year. The cost-saving measures taken by the city clerk range from emphasizing that staff adjust their schedules for hours worked in excess of the regular working hours to using outdated or surplus supplies or signage from municipal elections. Furthermore, the report identifies the one-time expenditures in 2010 that will not be incurred in future elections and suggests how future NC board member elections costs can be further minimized. Finally, our report provides feedback collected back during our NC feedback meetings, wherein the city clerk discussed possible options for implementing the neighborhood council elections in 2012. Among the options discussed were 1, NCs conducting their own elections, 2, NCs conducting their own elections with city clerk acting as an IEA, 3, the NCs opting to have city clerk or done hold their elections, 4, the city clerk continuing to hold the NC elections, and 5, done or the city clerk contracting the elections to an outside contractor. The report provides the pros and cons as provided by the NC leaders during the meetings. The city clerk is supportive of all of these options except for option number 3, because we believe this process would be unwieldy, confusing, and likely not cost-effective. In conclusion, the method for conducting NC elections in the future is a policy decision of the council and the mayor, and the city clerk therefore submits the previously mentioned 5 options for consideration. In addition to this verbal report, we've also submitted the answers to the questions that committee members asked of us during the last hearing, and we submit them for consideration.
All right, thank you very much. We're joined by Councilmember Janice Hahn as well. Ms. Hahn, welcome. Colleagues, we're also going to be hearing from the City Attorney's Office, but I think why don't we start with, and then hopefully we'll have the clerk come back up to respond to some of those points. But if you have questions now on this report, why don't we proceed with that, and then they'll come back again after the City Attorney's.
No, there's not.
Ms. Hahn, do you have any questions? I have a few here. So the report indicates that there were 315 open seats in the 2008 cycle and 1,583 seats in 2010. Now, I assume that part of that is due to a greater number of certified neighborhood councils, but I can't imagine that it would be quintuple. So what accounts for that number of increased seats?
The difference from 2008 to 2010 is that in 2008 we had a pilot program where we only implemented 22 of the neighborhood council elections. In 2010 we implemented 89.
Okay, so that's not the universe of open seats
Not the
that
same
were
universe.
voted upon. It was only those that were administered by the clerk. I see. All right, and I guess the one thing that really jumps out at me from these statistics, and this is a good statistical analysis to fall back on, that there were 1,669 candidates for 1,583 seats, which means that I assume the vast majority of seats were uncontested, and that there were only a handful where there was really a contest involved. Is that? Do you have any breakdown of how many were uncontested?
We do, and we can provide that to the council, a breakdown exactly of each seat for every neighborhood council.
Okay. Would that be a correct assumption that most of the seats were either uncontested or there was no one at all running for them?
That would be close.
Okay.
It pretty much ranged the gamut. There were some situations where no one ran. There were situations where it was equal number of candidates as offices, and then on the other end of the spectrum, there were some seats that were very, very intensely contested.
And I mean, a comment that I've heard frequently and that I think is probably plainly true is that part of the reason for that, if not the entirety of the reason for that, is that with a move to a more formal structure for elections administered by the clerk's office, which entails additional expense, there was less funding available to do citywide outreach and regional outreach, which led to a less robust participation in the election. Would that be a fair statement, do you think?
Well, it's true that the more outreach you do, the higher your turnout will be.
Okay.
And I think in reference to that specific statistic, though, I would make reference to the fact that in 2008, the city clerk did put out 2 mailers. And it wasn't so much that it was outreach, it was what information was provided as part of those mailers. It was information that could be acted upon, that were methods by which stakeholders could run for office and or vote. It provided an opportunity for them to engage in the process. It wasn't just outreach, it was the information that was provided therein.
And am I correct that in 2008, with those mailers that we did, that the breakdown was something like 2 candidates per seat?
Correct.
Yes.
So one of the challenges that you faced that again sort of leaps off the page is all the different ballot styles that you had to develop, and I assume that one of the driving forces for that is the fact that you have at the time 90 neighborhood councils, each with a different set of bylaws, each with a different structure for how their election is to be run, with different types of offices, different stakeholders eligible for running for and voting for each of those offices. Was that the biggest part of the problem there, that you had lack of uniformity among the neighborhood councils?
Being that the city clerk is not in the business of advising neighborhood councils how to govern themselves, they dispose and we implement. What they decide how they want their structure to be is how we would administer their election.
What would you say the impacts were in actually implementing the election, of having stakeholders be able to declare themselves to be such by factual basis?
Well, we did see a turnout of participation of 16.9% of overall turnout be factual basis stakeholders. But I think that where you did see an increase in their participation had 2 key factors to do with those elections. One, it was where a neighborhood council decided to include them in, to be able to vote and run for more seats rather than designate one single seat. And 2 is the level of competition in those neighborhood councils. So the more likely that there's competition, the more likely that those candidates will look beyond their borders or beyond their live, work, own property stakeholders to include more people to vote for them.
And from the clerk's perspective, with that also comes the fact that the more contested the seat, the more likely there will be to be challenges to whether someone really is a factual basis stakeholder, right? I mean, did you run into that problem of having challenges to whether or not somebody's factual basis is in fact a factual basis?
It went, I think it was on a case-by-case basis, because most people did come up and say very simple factual basis statements like, my son participates in this park advisory board, my child goes to school here. Where you had issue was where someone might say, I hear this often, I am a citizen of Earth. That is a little bit more difficult to
That's a
exact-
stakeholder.
It's a little difficult to challenge that issue. But it was made somewhat clearer by the simpler statements.
Are there non-citizens of Earth? I wonder.
I'm not sure.
Galaxy far, far.
Research that one.
Okay. I declared my factual basis in more than one neighborhood council as the council member representing the neighborhood, and I faced considerable degree of challenge to that. Actually, I had to prove where my office was and so forth. So, but it varied. I will say that it varied from polling place to polling place. So, sorry.
I'm sorry, listen to a voice.
Mr. Zine, anything yet? Have anything? You want to
I
wait?
have one question about that
What was the
Virginia
question?
bond for $100,000. What was that for?
Well, part of the reason for the challenge or not might have been the fact that there was documentation required for that factual basis statement in one neighborhood council versus another.
So it was not standard among,
Right.
from council to council either.
Even as to not just the qualifications, but how one demonstrates the
Correct.
qualifications is not
Correct.
even standardized, right? Okay.
Sorry, council member.
Did he, the $100,000+ what was that device for?
Those-
Systems machine.
Those were the scanners that were used to tally the ballots for the elections.
Now, can they be used for anything else?
They can be used, and I believe they're also used for the CRA elections.
Oh, yeah, Prop 218, street lighting and so forth.
So they can be used for other elections?
Yes.
Correct.
And they were purchased just for this, or did we already have them in stock? But what would we use to tabulate the other elections?
The
Oh, so now we have some technology?
Yes. We entered the 21st century.
Finally, okay, thank you.
How does that differ from what you use for an ordinary municipal election? Is there some reason that the hardware doesn't
Technology
work?
changes all the time. Holly, do you want to speak to that, being our systems techno expert?
I don't know that I claim to be the systems techno expert, but Holly Walcott with the Office of the
Might
City
be
Clerk.
a pay bonus, so.
Yeah. Can I plug my show again? So, during a municipal election, we use the 312 cards. So it's the Ink-a-Vote Plus system. There's so many different ballot types being used in the neighborhood council elections, we weren't able to use,
Okay,
there were just too many different ballot types.
yeah, okay.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Hunt?
No.
Nothing?
No.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We also have a report from the city attorney's office, and so is there somebody from the city attorney's office who would like to
Yes,
speak
good
to this?
afternoon, council members. Deputy City Attorney Darren Martinez. We basically prepared this report after receiving a number of complaints and objections that occurred after the elections. The most significant objection that we received was with respect to the term factual basis stakeholders and how people who were factual basis stakeholders were voting in neighborhood council elections. The recommendation that we're making is that City Council should consider and after holding appropriate public hearings to take input, a better standard, or to develop a better standard on what this factual basis stakeholder means or should mean. We had the city clerk here today talk about, somebody being a citizen of Earth. And in the practical ramifications of how this definition plays out, it plays difficulty, or it provides some problems for neighborhood councils with respect to how their elections are conducted. Moreover, to the extent that it seems to be comprised of just simple citizens of Earth, it undermines the credibility of the neighborhood councils themselves. So people aren't buying into their system, and they're not feeling that their system is representative of their area and their true stake in the area. The term itself, stakeholder, implies some type of stake, rather than simply being, well, I'm here on this planet. It implies a stake to the area and the neighborhood.
Right.
Accordingly, we're recommending that City Council should consider making appropriate changes to the definition. We don't have a recommendation on the definition that we're providing, but we are saying that it is appropriate, and we think it would be useful to reconsider the definition here. In terms of our resources, we spent a substantial amount of resources when these issues were raised. When people were coming in and complaining about, factual basis stakeholders and who could participate or not participate, it did take a number of the resources from our office to try to address and respond to these questions when they did come up. So it would also make it easier from a municipal standpoint and the use of our resources in our office. The other two recommendations that we had were a little bit more minor in scope, and they dealt with having a pre-registration voter process. Implicit in that recommendation, however, is that the city clerk, have the resources to be able to do, a voter pre-registration process. And the last item was, one of the large objections that we received were after neighborhood councils elected between having documentation or documentary proof of their stakeholder status versus simply being able to affirm whether they were stakeholders, and then people came in and made an objection about somebody, whether they were or were not a stakeholder. In cases where there was just an affirmation, there isn't the documentary evidence to underlie or to investigate whether the challenge has any validity. So for those neighborhood councils that make that choice, we would like it to be more clear, abundantly clear to them, that if you are selecting that option, it's going to preclude your ability to challenge whether somebody is a valid stakeholder, because you don't have any way to evaluate after the fact of whether or not they were in fact a valid stakeholder. There's simply no evidence.
On the pre-registration recommendation, is there any legal reason or practical reason that you can think of that that might only apply to factual basis stakeholders, so that if you want to assert that you're a stakeholder based on a factual basis, you would be required to register in advance so that that claim could be evaluated before the election? But if you live, work, own property in the neighborhood, you can walk in on election day and vote just by virtue of the fact that you are in that neighborhood.
No, certainly, and I think all of these are options worth exploring. The idea of the voter registration was motivated more by the fact of what is factual basis stakeholders in determining whether or not they were able to vote in the election. We're also not saying that we wouldn't allow any vote whatsoever on election day. Obviously, they would vote provisionally. But in terms of just managing the election, if they've been cleared in advance and somebody sees, like, well, you made the checklist, you're on there as a factual basis stakeholder, we'll allow the vote to come in. We also thought it would allow for some type of additional neighborhood council involvement in providing recommendations to the city clerk on what a factual basis is, and whether some type of a body that could help the city clerk in making these determinations on whether people really are factual basis stakeholders or not in their area. So it gives neighborhood councils additional ownership over the outcome of their elections.
Okay, thank you. Ms.
Well,
Hunt?
I will say that the definition of stakeholders was something we really wrestled with on the city charter a long time ago. And I will say that even the 912 Commission, I believe, took it up. Again, because it's been a constant issue, is what constitutes a stakeholder. And I believe, I can't remember, but I believe the 912 Commission punted on that one and basically said, no, stakeholder is anyone that, lives, works, plays. No, I don't think they said that. Goes to church, goes to school, goes to temple. I mean, that was definition of stakeholder. I do feel like we're seeing some abuses, whether it's I'm a citizen on this planet, or even I didn't like the neighborhood council's elections where people were told to go buy something at Taco Bell and come with their receipt, and that constituted a stakeholder. I really don't think that was our intention. Our intention was to make neighborhood councils larger than homeowner organizations. I mean, I think that's what we always struggled with in the City Charter Commission, was we have legitimate homeowner associations that exist, they function, they've been around a long time. Neighborhood councils were always supposed to be bigger than that, broader than that. It wasn't just people who owned a home. It really was people who had a stake in that neighborhood from a variety of, perspectives. So we really struggled with not defining what a stakeholder was, except for live, work, play, go to church, go to school. But it seems to me the city attorney is kind of leaning towards getting a little bit, better definition. But I would be comfortable with defining a little bit more, or, I'm just not comfortable with it if it gets too narrow, that we've missed what we really wanted to accomplish with neighborhood councils, was a bigger, broader voice in a neighborhood or community, and realizing that there are a lot of interests in a neighborhood besides just people who own homes. That's certainly, one of the number one interests, but we felt like there was a vehicle for that, and that was homeowner associations. We felt like there was a lot of people who loved communities, loved neighborhoods, had a stake in them from a variety of angles, and that's what we wanted to give voice to. Certainly, we've seen, now that we've had several elections, there are abuses to that, and I think one of the compelling arguments is that people are beginning to think it's a joke, or it's not serious, or they're losing faith in this ability for a neighborhood to actually have a legitimate voice when it comes to issues, on the city council or that affect their neighborhood. So it'd be interesting, to pursue this idea of defining it a little bit more, but really as one of the, forefathers and foremothers of this, we specifically did not define it because we wanted to give a different voice to neighborhoods than what already existed.
And there was an issue at that time regarding status in the country. There was the question regarding, are you a United States citizen? And that issue came up, and that certain people wanted to exclude people, even though they lived in the area, worked in the area.
If they weren't a
But
citizen.
the immigration issue started to penetrate, and that we didn't want to deal with that. So it was basically open. If you work, live, play, whatever, you would be eligible. But I've heard of dogs being registered to vote and all kinds of other issues that have been brought up. No, not this. I mean, and I will say, I was at a number, 2 or 3 of the sites where your folks were running the show. There was one at the fire station. You were at the fire station on Burbank, in Woodland Hills, and it was done very, very professional. But I was amazed at how many candidates, or how many lack of candidates versus the slots. It seems like if you just put your name in, you could be elected. And that was part of the problem, is you had a lot of seats that no one even ran for, and you got other areas where, in fact, in front of the fire station, people were out campaigning in front of the fire station as you drove in to vote. So there were a lot of issues back and forth. But no, your folks did a great job. It was done in a very legitimate fashion. There was another one at Shadow Ranch Park, where they had another election taking place there, and that seemed to have quite a few people, but a bunch of ballots in different districts and different names and this and this. I mean, it was somewhat confusing, and I'm sure for you folks, it was complicated to put it all together. It's like you go to vote, and you've got the second district, you've got candidates, and you got one ballot, and you select the candidates, obviously Mr. Paul Krikorian. But when you go and you find all these different, am I in this, I am that, am I in this zone or that zone, it becomes very confusing. I live in Zone 2, but my business is in Zone 3. So, I mean, it'd be like you're in the neighborhood council, you're running an election in Studio City, so what live, work, or play in Studio City, and this whole issue of you're in Zone 1 or Zone 2 or District, that really creates quite a complicated situation. So, I mean, no criticism to the clerk's office. You did a great job. And it was definitely a complicated situation.
And that issue of confusion is really very significant. I mean, we've had recent presidential elections whose outcome was determined by, in my view, ballot confusion in Broward County, for example, when people are going to vote for President of the United States. So when people are going to neighborhood council elections and they're presented with this immensely complicated ballot with, complicated choices and who's qualified to vote for what offices.
And you don't know many of them.
And yeah, exactly. I think that creates even greater challenge and a greater it subjects these elections to more attacks on credibility. And Ms. Hahn described the factual basis stakeholder as kind of creating the possibility of this becoming more of a joke and losing its credibility. The opposite is also true. The more authority that we extend to neighborhood councils and the more that we engage neighborhood councils in the actual governance of the city, the more room there is for those who would want to do mischief to want to come and try to adversely influence neighborhood council elections. And we already have 1 out of 6 voters in these elections being factual basis stakeholders. Imagine if we significantly increased the authority that neighborhood councils have, how much some particular interest with who has an interest in the outcome of their rulings on things might, to put it candidly, take over neighborhoods by bussing in so-called factual basis stakeholders. And that, I think, while it's true we don't want this to just be another version of homeowners associations, by its very nature, a neighborhood council is not, because it's part of the governance of this city. And so even if it were to be restricted, it would still be a different kind of animal than a homeowner association. But I get your point, and I think the sweet spot that we want to try to get to is identifying what really is a real stakeholder in a neighborhood. And that is going to probably vary from neighborhood to neighborhood somewhat. But I wonder if anybody, and I want to ask Mr. Kim to come up because I think the department also has a report on the elections. And Mr. Kim, if you want to just go ahead and come up. But as he's coming up, one thought that I don't know has been analyzed at all is one way that might create a little bit more gravity to a factual basis stakeholder's self-assertion as a factual basis stakeholder is if you can only vote in one neighborhood council election. Right now, we have a situation where somebody could, like me, I mean, I voted in several because of the fact of that I was the elected representative for those neighborhoods. But if we wanted to broaden it beyond homeowners, but still create some kind of connection with a particular neighborhood, one way to do that might be to ask stakeholders to choose which neighborhood are you a stakeholder in, and you get one choice. That's going to increase the gravity, I think, of the selection process a little bit, and it'll avoid some of the mischief that could otherwise be done by those who, are not concerned about a democratic outcome.
I like that term, mischief.
Mr. Kim, welcome.
Thank you, council members.
You have a report that I think you had just
Yes, I do.
issued.
B.H. Kim, General Manager, Department of Neighborhood Empowerment. And before I give you an overview of the way that the department ran the neighborhood council elections, just for comparison's sakes, I would offer my views on the factual basis stakeholder that Councilperson Han is correct that the NCRC really tried to tackle the issue, but once you get into trying to codify what a factual basis stakeholder is, it becomes a very slippery slope. So they maintained what the charter and is described in the ordinance, that neighborhood council system is really designed to be as inclusive as possible. Mm-hmm. Now, one way to approach the factual basis stakeholder issue is what's the problem that the solution is looking to solve? Mm-hmm. And if the main concern around factual basis stakeholder is the potential for takeover, there are a number of ways that we've been working with neighborhood councils at the level of the bylaws, because that's the major way to insulate in a number of ways. One is by designating geographic designations and also stakeholder categories, that it really it makes it that much harder for a group to bus in a number of people to be able to vote in every geographic area of a neighborhood council. Secondly, you also have staggering term limits. So that's another provision that would make it difficult for a takeover. And then lastly, the way that the city clerk and city attorney department addressed this issue of factual basis stakeholder was minimally we recommended that each neighborhood council board establish one factual basis stakeholder seat on the board where a factual basis stakeholder could only vote for that seat. So that's to give you a perspective of how to insulate neighborhood councils by approaching it at that level as opposed to trying to impose a citywide policy.
The flip side, though, on the geographical boundaries issue is that when you have, the more that you break up a neighborhood into geographical seats like that, the more certainty there is going to be that you're going to have uncontested seats. And I think that's what we saw in this last election. We saw lots and lots and lots of seats where there was either no one running for it, or there was just an incumbent running for re-election, or one person running for election in that seat. So there's in theory, it makes sense. It increases the degree of democratic representativeness of the neighborhood council when you have smaller geographical areas. But the reality is, at least that we saw in this election, was that you also have a big drop-off in the number of contested seats.
Right.
Sorry, go right ahead.
If I may just provide you with a brief overview, because of the discussions that I've heard at the committee level were that there are a number of points that you had been discussing. One is it has to be cost-effective. Whatever we look to do in 2012 has to be aware of the city's budget constraints. I also heard that you're looking for a way to combine the best aspects of grassroots participation with well-run neighborhood council elections. And the department will support both the mayor and the council's office and work with neighborhood councils to get us there, because I think the department has been running elections since its inception, and then we went to the city clerk, and now we're looking for something that will hopefully hit the sweet spot of what works for the neighborhood councils and works for the city as well. The department advises that our advice is to maintain the elections with the city clerk, because the department's role really should be to lead with empowerment as opposed to enforcement. And that was also the NCRC's recommendations. And if there is a role for our department in the elections, I would advise it would be around outreach, because that is probably one of the areas that was the most weak in terms of the city clerk run elections. So to give you a little context for how the department approached neighborhood council elections, because we're not professional election administrators, we're in the business of supporting neighborhood councils, we approach neighborhood council elections in the context of our mission, which is defined in the charter: promote more civic engagement and to help neighborhood councils be more effective advisors to city leaders. It was a very organic process in a lot of ways. We ended up running anywhere from 70 to 75 neighborhood council elections per year. We had a little less than 10% who were violating the then city the election procedures, which required them to hold timely elections. And we were devoting anywhere from 30 to 40% of our total staff time. Back then, it was an average of around 40 full-time equivalent staff. Because of the unpredictable nature of the way that we were running elections, it created quite a bit of workload. The election components emphasized when we were designing the election procedures, as you may recall, Councilperson Hahn, that neighborhood councils in the beginning were running their own elections. But there was a lot of chaos that was caused by that. So then the city had to put together a citywide elections procedures. We were staffing that. We worked very closely with then City Clerk Frank Martinez to develop a citywide elections procedures, with neighborhood councils having their own election procedures written and approved by the department, by which the neighborhood councils would be held accountable to their stakeholders. Outreach was a major part of the way that we ran elections. So the city paid for 2 mailers for every neighborhood council election. And NCs were very strongly encouraged to do the advance work in terms of recruiting candidates and to pay for their own outreach, in addition to what the city's role and resource contribution was. We trained and managed a pool of consultants we ended up calling Independent Election Administrators, which is IEA, not to be confused with the other acronym involved in wartime. But they were responsible for processing the candidate verifications. They managed the voting process and the ballots that were collected, and then they confirmed the results. The election challenges, while there was a design to do a citywide election challenge panel that was composed of neighborhood council volunteers, the staff resources weren't available at the time. So we needed an independent entity, and at that time it was the Human Relations Commission, and they conducted the challenge review, and they were the final decision makers. The direct assistance that the department provided to neighborhood councils to conduct their own elections. We approved their election procedures. There were bylaw amendments that would take place because there are a number of provisions in their bylaws that had to comply with the elections. Sometimes you had new incoming board members that wanted to change their bylaws, so that also drove a number of workload indicators for the department. We also helped when organizational issues with neighborhood councils impeded the way that they could follow their own election procedures. We assisted with the printed materials. Oftentimes the neighborhood councils would ask city's general services department to print the election materials, and we would also assist there. There were also translation services that we would provide for the neighborhood councils. When neighborhood councils wanted to do their own mass mail distribution, we would assist there. And as I stated before, we were managing the independent election administrators. And we also developed election procedures templates so that neighborhood councils had a tool by which they could manage their own elections. And in conclusion, my advice to this committee, in order to try to approach that sweet spot of promoting more civic participation while assuring that elections are well run, is to allow neighborhood councils to run their own elections, with the city clerk playing a monitoring role so that there is compliance with citywide standards. And if whatever budget figure ends up after that is figured out, I would strongly advise that the department be allocated some resources to help with outreach. I think, as I recently conducted a survey among neighborhood councils to ask them what they thought the priorities of the department should be, in addition to the main functions that we provided, outreach and marketing came up as one of the major needs, that not enough people know about what neighborhood councils do. And a simple invitation, as I think was mentioned when City Clerk ran the 2008 elections, is a simple invitation to get involved with a neighborhood council that comes from official department like the City Clerk really does matter. And it's very simple to participate in neighborhood councils, but it's hard if you don't know about it.
Okay, thank you. So your staff has been decimated. Your budget's been significantly cut. We have years of experience now with an election run by the city clerk's office, which I think by most accounts was technically very proficient in its implementation, but we've also seen a significant drop-off in participation because of lack of outreach. So given all those factors, what would be your recommendation for how we get more money to do outreach, because it's not really realistic to expect that we're going to see a significant new infusion of general fund dollars to be able to do outreach. If we continue to spend at the same rate that we're spending for a clerk-run election, and by the way, I'm going to want to come back to that because I don't think we need to, and I think the clerk has some thoughts about that, which we'll revisit in a minute. But if we're spending that much money for a clerk-run election, we just don't have the money to do the outreach, and the less outreach that we do, the less need we have for a clerk-run election. So what's your best thought and best recommendation on where we strike that balance?
Well, one place we may want to look is the neighborhood council's own funding. There are a number of neighborhood councils that use their money for outreach.
Well, and on that point, I've had two, as you know, Mr. Kim, I've had 2 town halls now to draw input from the neighborhood councils and from the general public on some of these policy issues. And on the issue of elections, almost everybody noted a decreased level of participation, except those neighborhood councils that took over outreach on their own. And in those cases, they saw a dramatic increase in participation. So there's a direct correlation between the neighborhood council's own outreach in their own neighborhoods and participation levels.
In their best interest.
And that's certainly a role that the department could play to try to coordinate what the most effective ways for neighborhood councils would be to do outreach. We worked with a couple of regional coalitions where they collectively organized a campaign, and that got a lot of bang for the buck in terms of visibility. But I can't underemphasize the importance of outreach, because the lifeblood of neighborhood councils is people.
Yeah.
And the most dangerous indicator is the kind of data points that you suggested in terms of the number of people that are running for the open board seats. If those numbers don't increase, those are very dangerous indicators for the future health of the neighborhood council system.
Let me bring up another point on that outreach. I know that in certain areas they produce brochures, and it's touting an individual on the neighborhood council that's done this, that, or the other. I know we have blackout periods running for public office. I don't think they have blackout periods. And I think what it does is it serves as an advantage to an individual who's running in a district for a council seat. We have elections coming up where there's no blackout period. they could put a lot of information out and have an advantage over an individual who is also a member of neighborhood council who doesn't have that opportunity. And I've seen that happen where we need to have something to make it fair for all people. I know that, and I'm not up for re-election. I'm on my last term along with Ms. Hahn, but Mr. Krikorian is. And I think that he's in a blackout period. He can't do certain things, whereas a neighborhood council person who may or may not decide to run against him can go out there and do all the publicity they wish at the expense of the neighborhood council on that $45,000 expenditure. That could create quite a dilemma.
Don't give anybody any ideas.
Well, I've already seen part of it happen, and that's my concern, is that it serves as an advantage to those that want to take advantage of it, and there's no restriction. They can do whatever they want, and if they're in an executive position on the neighborhood council, they can use that money with the board's approval, and the board wants to support them. Now they get all this publicity regarding neighborhood council with their smiling face and what they're going to do and this and that and the other. That has to be explored, and there's a concern with that.
And the converse could also be true, because if we're counting on neighborhood councils to take the laboring oar on outreach, well, it might be in the interests of incumbent board members of that neighborhood council not to do any outreach. Because what if you held an election and nobody showed up? Well, the incumbents who go there and vote and know about it would have a much better chance of getting reelected. So, it's not necessarily in the interest of neighborhood democracy, I think, to have the city not take a role, a more robust role in publicizing elections and doing the outreach.
And I'm just talking about the candidate, not so much the election, I'm talking about the candidate.
Yeah.
And
Well,
addressing
I
that-
think that's right. I know there's some grumbling in the audience when we talked about neighborhood councils using their own funding, but it's absolutely in your best interest as a neighborhood council to want more outreach. That's, as you said, is the lifeblood of these neighborhood councils. You're basically funding your own future, your own health, your own vitality. I mean, you want people to know about you, so maybe a compromise. I can hear the grumbling now, but maybe a compromise is, the neighborhood councils offering up some funding, but yet still having the city clerk do it to lessen the idea of unfair advantage of outreach when it came to an incumbent board member, and that would be a compromise. But again, I think. I think that's a positive thing for your funding. It is. It's for your health, your benefit. You want more people to know about what's going on. You want more people coming to your meetings. You want more people running for these offices. And if you can help fund that, I think it's in your best interest. It's like when we try to get people to contribute a little bit to their own retirement. It's not like we're asking people to contribute to something that has nothing to do with them. That's their own future. That's their own retirement. It's in their best interest to want to contribute to that. So I see this as a similar issue.
I agree. And on the issue of using public funds for individual candidates running for board seats, that's a prohibition. So that's something we would monitor if we found that individuals were using public funds in that purpose. Our role would be to advise neighborhood councils to use public funds for outreach that would benefit the neighborhood council as a whole, as opposed to individual candidates.
There's a neighborhood council that has he may not be a consultant anymore, but he was a consultant to this neighborhood council. He's currently running for a council seat. And he was a neighborhood council consultant at, I thought, a pretty good expense for what he was doing. And now he's running against an incumbent on a city council seat.
Yeah.
I see that as somewhat of a conflict, and there has to be a clarification. We want neighborhood council members involved. We want neighbors to get involved. We want them to run for elective office, but play a level playing field. And I think it is not a level playing field when you find some of these things taking place.
Thank you, Mr. Kim.
Thank you.
June, if you could come back up for 1 second. First of all, I wanted to give you the opportunity to respond to any of the things that you heard, either from us or from the city attorney or from Dunn, about if there's. I wanted to give you kind of the last word on this discussion about thoughts that they've had about changes that could be made, if you have any. And I also wanted to talk to you a little bit about some cost reduction strategies that we might have if the clerk were to continue as Mr. Kim suggested, with the operation of the elections, if there are thoughts that you've given to how we might be able to bring the costs down.
We've been, in addition to our written report where we presented you with some options for how to run neighborhood council elections in the future, life is an ongoing process and our minds continue to work. So we've been still thinking about it the last, 48 hours. And so a thought that has occurred to us is exactly the point that you have made, that we take pride that we believe we can administer elections professionally, but there has to be that balance with getting the word out, because that promotes turnout. An idea that we're sort of bouncing around in our heads is the idea where we might add well, first of all, let me back up a little bit. We totally acknowledge that the neighborhood council elections are the elections of the neighborhoods. They belong to the people. And so with all that we've learned from 2010, what we would like to do is take it all back to a neighborhood council development committee, which would be made up of the stakeholders, our office, mayor's office, Dunn, Bonk, and go over everything again that's written on paper, and make sure that we all are tighter on that we're all on the same page. Insofar as the future elections, if there is the possibility that we could consider adding a third arm to the Dunn and Clerk paradigm, and that is we could incorporate independent election administrators in the role of information and communication clearinghouse. That is to say, we might consider administering the contracts of, say, an election administrator, IEA, for one of the 9 different regions, because we are thinking that what we have seen in the San Fernando Valley is very positive. The geographic alignment of different neighborhood councils into a geographic area. So we have an idea of conducting the pre-election planning on a regional basis, not the actual election itself, which we would continue to do polling place by polling place. But in numbers, there are strength, and many neighborhood councils together in a region can help each other, can cross-pollinate each other. The strong can support the weak. The wise can help the beginning. So these independent, I have trouble saying that, these IEAs would be a person that was assigned specifically to that region to make sure that information was flowing equally in and out, to make sure that deadlines are met, to facilitate outreach, to increase energy, and would be, I think, a great partner to Dunn.
Are these staff?
No, these would be outside. No. Contractors. They would be hired during the election season and released after election season was over. But their role would, instead of being an administrator of the election, they would be more toward the beginning part in generating that interest in educating people.
Who are these people? They exist, or you just?
We would create an RFP and we would hire them.
How much were you paid?
These are all things that we need to
These
look
people,
into.
they're all out there. These people exist right now.
What the people that you are thinking of are folks that have had experience actually administering the election. I'm thinking of a slightly different role for them. That is to say, if we could put more energy, divide the energy so that there is more energy in the pre-planning and pre-election period, getting candidate interest up, getting word out about the election.
I'm just trying to figure out who these people are. They're just average people that you train to do this, or do they exist?
These
as
would
company?
be people. These
There's
would be
an
people who
IEA
have
company out there.
No,
Okay.
not an IEA company, but suppose they would have a certain composite set of skills that are
So they're just average
media
people
relations
that you hire.
Media relations, public relations, community activists.
I'm confused about the concept.
The pre-election stage of outreach and
Yeah, I know, but I'm trying to figure out who are you hiring? Personal services contracts. So you're hiring.
so we
okay,
would-
how many are you hiring?
We, as an example.
Like 20 people?
No, if we do what we are thinking of doing is creating 9 regions for the
Right.
90 neighborhood councils, there would be 1 per region.
So 9 people you're going to hire.
And they would be on temporary contract.
Okay.
They would, if you like, the city clerk would consider administering their contracts, but their day-to-day work is not election work per se. They would work.
I got it. Whatever it is, I'm just trying to figure out what pool are you hiring them from? Just you're putting the word out. Unemployed people.
I think it's back to your average person.
Yeah.
scenario.
Okay. So 9 average people you're going to hire, and
9
that you
outstanding
think
average
have
people.
outstanding average people that have this kinds of skills, and what would the salary be?
These are things that we have to iron out.
Okay, I'm
We
just
have
trying
to.
to. I'm just trying to look. If we're
not
already
trying-
if we're
we're
already
not trying
limited
to
on
promote-
on our budget, I don't know who's paying for this.
Come out of the $45,000.
Yeah, well, I think
What we're trying to do is we're not trying to say we're going to charge the same amount we did as last election plus more money.
Right.
We're going to try and
Oh, okay.
incorporate it in a
Okay.
budget and even try to bring it
Okay.
down so that it
Okay.
ends up in less work for the clerk.
I got
and
it.
less staff costs on our side.
Okay, I just can.
Yeah,
the concept.
It's a different way of dividing the labor.
We haven't budgeted out any of the scenarios.
Okay.
We're trying to get a direction of where the policymakers would like to go so that we can come in under budget and still accomplish what you like to accomplish, but we do need some direction from the council.
Another way that we might rethink it is we certainly had encouraged and had hoped for better volunteer poll worker turnout. And we got some interest, but, it kind of petered out. What we would like to see is if the regions would commit to us in writing, we will commit to providing you with X amount of volunteer poll workers on election day. Again, that would help ameliorate our costs and is just a win-win situation for, being a partnership with the community.
let me ask you a question on that point, because we've just had a very healthy discussion within council about the possibility of eliminating city polling places for city council elections and moving to an all mail-in ballot system. So if the city attorney has suggested a pre-registration component of neighborhood council elections, wouldn't it be possible if we were to go down that road and ask people to pre-register to vote in a neighborhood council election? Anyone who pre-registers could get a mail-in ballot, and we could eliminate polling places entirely for these elections, or at worst, couldn't we consolidate them into a handful of regional polling places on election day so that multiple neighborhood councils in a region could go to a single polling place and cast their
All of these
their-
models are
their-
possible.
That would be a significant cost reduction, wouldn't it, if you didn't have
Fewer
to have
polling
a
places,
separate polling
absolutely.
place in each neighborhood council?
I don't know that there would have to be some startup costs because we would have to develop the database for the we would have to develop the registration system. I would very much like to go in that direction because it does open the door later on for doing things such as, online voting or telephone voting. But you do
Absolutely.
have to set up the infrastructure first. So as far as it being a reduction in cost the first time around, probably not.
Well, it might not be initially, but it certainly, I
But
think
down
it
the
certainly
line, it
would
would
be
be.
for the long term. It'd be a cost savings, but also it would make it much easier for people to participate, and you would
Absolutely.
probably have an increase in
Absolutely,
participation.
as long as you still spent the money for the outreach, because what Hawaii experienced, Hawaii went that way for their neighborhood council elections, and the one issue they ran across was the funds were not spent on outreach. So it's technically possible, it's physically possible. We'd have to come back to you with what the costs are, but you still need to spend one way or the other, whether it's neighborhood council money or it's another source, you still have to spend the money on outreach.
Right.
My staff passed me a statistic that our best guesstimate is if we were to run the neighborhood council elections, all vote by mail is almost 1.5, and that just is running the election. that does not include outreach or anything else.
But what is that? What assumption is that based on in terms of distributing ballots, for example? Because the idea that I just threw out is you have a very limited universe of those who choose to pre-register. So you're not mailing ballots out to every registered voter or every resident in a neighborhood. You're only mailing ballots to those who essentially request them by pre-registering. That's a very small. I think that's going to be a very small number.
Well, and speaking to why there isn't, or the difference between an all vote by mail versus the current model that we use, the financial difference is negligible because even though we cut costs insofar as ballots, printed polling places, staff for those polling places, we actually have to hire on the back end a lot more vote by mail verifiers to make sure that for those people that would conceivably register, when we do receive the ballot, we compare it to their original application. We make sure that there's no voter fraud being committed. So the back-end process would increase in cost to about the same amount as our current process.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna have to see that laid out a little bit better than we have time to do right now, and time is running short. So I didn't mean to cut you off. If you have any other comments, feel free. Otherwise, I want to wrap up questions and go to public comment while we still have a little bit of time, because I don't think we've gotten 3 reports today. We're going to have to process this a little bit. We have a universe of information that we obtained through the town halls, so I think we're going to have to still integrate all of that before we're prepared to report this out to council. So I'm going to suggest that I'm going to recommend that we hold this in committee until the next regular meeting for further consideration. But I do want to give you an opportunity for any last comments that we
No, I
catch
don't
up.
think I have. Is there anything else that we
No,
should bring to their
I was just trying to
attention?
remember that somebody brought up I was trying to remember what the proposal was, but there are proposals that would require pre-registration. And I just can't remember which one that one was.
The city attorney had recommended that as part of their
Right,
report.
but there was a subsequent proposal that something be done a certain way. I think it had to do with the stakeholder definition.
I think you said that if we limit factual basis stakeholders to choose one
Oh, that's right.
that
Yeah.
they
So
could
You'd have to
adhere
have-
to, then
you'd have to
you
have-
have to have pre-registration.
Right, exactly. Okay, any other questions?
No, no.
Mr. Snook? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, that brings us to public comment. The first speaker is Chris Rao, followed by Lisa Sarkin, followed by Judy Price.
You have to get row right.
You know, half the time I get it right, half the time I get it wrong. It's like,
I've got 2 cards. Can you combine it in one?
sure.
Thank you. I'm Chris Rowe. There are so many things that I could comment on that I heard here today, but my time is limited. So this is what I'm going to say to you. I have lived since 1973 in Reseda, in Northridge, Canoga Park, Winnetka, Woodland Hills, and West Hills. I have worked at Northridge Hospital, Tarzana Hospital, and West Hills Hospital. I've attended Pierce College, CSUN, and I've been to UCLA and Cedars-Sinai. So am I a stakeholder when I've been actively involved in all those cities? Okay, just like you voted in a number of elections.
There you are.
Okay, I know I am, and I voted in 3 elections. And what I'm going to tell you, as a neighborhood council member in one of Councilmember Zine's areas, there are advantages. First of all, I want to tell Councilmember Zine, guess what? West Hills has no money because we didn't get any rollover money. We have no money to fund any elections. We don't have any money to fund anything right now.
What's your $45,000?
It was the rollover that we had encumbered before has been taken out. Everything encumbered is coming out of our current money. So we have no money. Please be aware. So we couldn't do anything. We have, because I've been here before you before, I want you to be very aware that, because you keep bringing up what a neighborhood council member could do in the future. And I'm telling you, what I brought today, I voted. Okay, this is where I should vote, West Hills. This is where I'm a resident, and I believe we should declare a stake in one entity as was suggested today. And the reason is I'm willing to give up my stake in all of them, even though, for example, Councilmember Zine, I co-authored legislation, a motion before my board, which was passed with Barry Seibert of my board on a crosswalk. And that was in conjunction with Woodland Hills, because just across the street is Woodland Hills. So I have a stake because I've been working with the Woodland Hills Neighborhood Council. So what I'm saying is that I'm willing to give up that stake in Woodland Hills, even though I'm involved with Pierce College, as you know. I'm involved with crosswalk legislation. And I'm willing to say because the word is chutzpah. I would have to say I have a lot of chutzpah if I think that I know what's going on in every neighborhood that I drive my car through, every place I go to Taco Bell. I don't. I'll tell you what I do know. When I was at Fairwinds last night with the residents of Fairwinds talking about T-Mobile putting up cell phone antennas on the top of the hill, there with zoning committee and our cell phone committee, listening to the residents of Fairwinds, that's when I know I'm representing my community. So when I talk about what a stakeholder was in the beginning of all this, and I want you to know I filled a vacancy in the past. This was my first election. So, and I was in Group A, so it was at the beginning. We have challenges, and when you're talking about a blackout period, another time maybe you can explain that to me better. But here's how I see it for our neighborhood councils. Yes, we have a website right now. We do have who our names are and what committees we're on, or a slight definition of who we are. That does give us an advantage. But other people who were candidates built big websites, fancy websites, and sent out all kinds of email blasts because they had access to databases. We could not send out as a neighborhood council member something that said, vote for me with an endorsement below it or something on our database. So there is challenges. And as you have said, personally, I've heard you say this before, you're worried about money coming into this. The amount of money should be limited as to what a candidate can spend. So I'm just going to conclude with saying I would like to limit the definition of a stakeholder more narrowly to a resident based on this. And I'm going to turn this in on the record.
Thank you.
For the record, Fairwinds is a retirement facility in the 3rd Council District.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Lisa Sarkin, followed by Judy Price.
Good afternoon. I jotted down some notes, just as I did last time. Maybe I'll get these all in this time. None of you are elected by anybody other than registered voters. I don't know if we can register voters. Of course, the stakeholder is not just a resident, and it should be that way. That's the whole point of neighborhood councils. I don't know if somebody just driving through should be allowed to do it. The only challenges and problems that we've ever had in our neighborhood council in Studio City are the factual basis ones. We had tennis players that were bussed in. We had a community organization that never met in Studio City and did not have a list, but they had a little office there. They bussed in 200 people for one election. I didn't win that year. So, I mean, that's a sore spot to us. So we identified our community organizations this time, and so only those were supposed to be allowed to vote. But we voted and we sent in a registration form that we approved. But that wasn't used in our election. The registration form that was used was so confusing that no one knew that they could all vote for the at-large seat. No one knew which seat they could vote for, and each one of our seats are specific. And you have to have a specific thing in order to run for that seat, so why don't you have to have that same exact thing, for instance, a business license with an address in Studio City, to vote for a business owner? People came in and they voted. They said they were employees and business owners of the same exact business. So that was brought to the attention of the city clerk, but no provisional ballots were issued. Even during the election, 4 board members went up to our city clerk advisor and reminded her, but we never got a single one, not one single one. The other thing is, when we voted for self-affirmation, there was no notification whatsoever that you couldn't challenge. I understand now how hard it would be to do that because you don't have to have the documentation with you or how you can approve it later. But even if those people were given provisional ballots, this is a question I think we need to know. How would we go back later and find out why they were given that provisional ballot. Do we ask them now, give us the information that you didn't have to bring with you to begin with? I think we need to figure that out. Also, just one more thing. In our election in 2007, we had a gigantic hotbed issue of too much 597 units proposed for Ventura Boulevard in 6 different residential developments. Over 1,000 people voted. In 2010, we had just as big of a big hotbed item. There was just as much money spent by the candidates to get the word out, and our neighborhood council spent $6,000 on outreach, and we only had 636 voters. So I don't know what happened, but I think a lot of it was that nothing went out from done like it did in the other elections, and we didn't have enough from the city clerks no matter what we did, and I think that was really awful. We should have had more voters in the next time. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next speaker is Judy Price, followed by Wayne Spindler.
Good afternoon. I have to say I'm encouraged by some of the things I'm hearing today from the city clerk's office, but I do still have some strong opinions. I think that they do add credibility when there are mailers from the city clerk. That kind of outreach is very important. But of course that was lost because of budget cuts. You know, they did not happen. It was up to the individual neighborhood councils. That is a problem because if you have a neighborhood council running for all the seats, they're trying to protect their own job, so they don't necessarily do the outreach that is necessary. I do agree with Janice at the expense of my fellow neighborhood councils here. The original intent of the funding was for outreach. It was. And I know that Mr. Kim will confirm that. It has been expanded to include a lot of other neighborhood projects. Now, you have to understand that that's also necessary because we've had budget cuts. No, medians aren't being taken care of. You know, there's a lot of expenses in communities that didn't exist before. But I do think that there should be a requirement for a certain amount for outreach. You know, I mean, it really is what the money was there for. I do not think the city clerk should be the final arbiter. I don't think that they should be the final decision maker. If there's challenges, it should be an IEA, but not as they describe it, more like it used to be. Because I think that we would have a lot less problems. The self-affirmation, I will recommend my neighborhood council never do that again. We didn't have the problem this election, but I know what Studio City went through. And you should not be able to challenge, ever. You know, I thought that was part of every election. You know, am I mistaken? I mean, if, you know, challenge voters or challenge, you know, candidates. I do not like the pre-registration. I think what you suggest, though, in terms of the factual basis, that's different.
Why don't you like the pre-registration?
Because I think it's going to discourage more participation. The whole idea is to get more participation, not less. Right. And if you have pre-registration, you're going to cut it off before the election. And the best outreach is really going into the election. It's also, well, of course, soliciting candidates, which is another problem, getting enough people to know about it. But I think the more roadblocks you throw, the less participation you're going to find. And believe me, I would like to have 600 voters. You know, Studio City, that may be low for you, but we have never, ever come anywhere close to that. And it's a lack of outreach. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Our next speaker is Wayne Spindler, followed by Barbara Monahan Burke. Mr. Spindler, you also had a public comment card. If you want to combine your time, that's fine.
Yeah, I can combine
it. However you want to do
That'd be good.
Okay.
All right, so it'd give me 4 minutes. Okay. Yeah, I've worked on several campaigns. I was involved with the Vahedi versus Koretz campaign, the Trutanich campaign for city attorney. And there's 96 of these council committees, these neighborhood councils, and it's a waste of time. It's nothing but a drain of resources and money. The city's broke. You're going to cut funding for whatever you're doing. Even in this building, you get carpets that are sorely in need of replacing. There's a maintenance schedule outside budget cuts. They're going to put a ballot measure to take and cut police and fire pensions while you give a DWP an increase. I go to these meetings. I went to the ENC meetings a couple of times, And there's meetings that are general meetings, there's meetings that are meetings separately for planning and land use. These are just miniature versions of the council. There's so many meetings, there's so many elections that nobody knows what the hell's going on. And we went down there, me and a couple of homeowners, and there's in CD5, they want to put a pool in to build this pool, and nobody wants the pool there because they're going to have excess parking. Everybody on the panel agreed. They didn't want it, but one woman was there. She ran the meeting, and she said, no, you're not allowed to vote on this. And they went downtown the next day, and then they rammed it through. There's no power. You're not giving these committees any real power. They don't have any power to toss anybody off the council. They don't have any power to sit on the council. They don't have any power to review any decisions. They're advisory. They're nothing. You take a look at the map. The 15 council districts, like CD5, for example, they marry Encino in the Valley all the way to West LA. Why? Sorry to say the sick reason for it is because it's a Jewish district. They're taking West Side Pico Jewish people and Encino Jewish people and binding them together down the 405. This is a religious and racial gerrymandered district. You have CD15, which makes more sense because it mends the harbor down to the south portion of the city. But in Janice Hahn's district, you have 4 sub-offices for this area. Denizine has 1. Smith has 2. So there's nothing that's happening with these things, with these neighborhood councils, that's going to directly make impacts. The homeowners can't do anything. And then another example is special lighting assessment districts. There's many things that go on discussions, and in the end, what happens is they want the money. They make a special ballot for that, where 3 or 4 homeowners get to vote, and if nobody votes, it's a tie, and the tie goes to the developer, and all people have to get a special assessments. You look at your property tax bills. I get 3 of them, and every one of them is littered with a 1% is Prop 13. The tax rate effectively now is 1.275% property taxes that you're paying on every $100,000 of assessed value. That's 3 properties, $18,000, and a 10% sales tax. And you have 96 of these little bodies that are running their own elections. And finally, the question of citizenship has come up. Anybody, an illegal alien, can run on these neighborhood councils and vote. One of the first ones of these I saw was one that was held in Koreatown, where it was strictly in Spanish. They were holding them out in Spanish, telling everybody to vote, and they went into the school, and you could vote regardless of your citizenship. And the franchise needs not be extended to anybody but citizens. And if you're going to expand it to non-citizens, the next thing you know, we're going to extend the whole franchise there. So it goes in a place that we don't need to go. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Barbara Monahan Burke, followed by Noel Weiss.
Good afternoon, committee members. I'm speaking personally. I actually challenged the election in my area for many, many reasons. I would like to say first that I do support the 3 proposals that City Attorney Trutanich and his office have made, with the exception that I know they've made reference to the city clerk in that. I do not agree with the city clerk for the elections. In Studio City, our election in many ways was disastrous. And I'm going to tell you a few of the ways. Okay. First, there was total disregard for our stipulation language. Nothing corresponded on the cover sheet to our stipulation language so that anything could be clear back and forth from it. And the staffers from the city clerk's division were not consistent in what they told the voters as they came in, which ballots, which ones got, whether they got the ones for the at-large or whatever else. There was no consistency to it. Also, there was electioneering that was going on, and no one stopped until myself and others went to tell the city clerk for it. The posting of the language for where the boundaries were was wrong, and we had to ask over and over to have that changed. We asked for the, as Lisa said, for the ballots that would be the temporary ballots, so we could clear things up later. They were not given out, even though we were told that they would be given out. Challenges, we were told because it was self-affirmation that they wouldn't be done, but that was only afterwards. They changed the rules after we did the stipulation language. So over and over and over, we had a really bad time with this election. Also, the survey that the city clerk's office gave out, the election city clerk gave out, they self-determined basically most of what they were going to get back as the results, because they didn't let us do any kind of criticism within the workshops of what happened this year. They just wanted to go forward and look at what was coming instead of anything that had happened. So of course you're getting much higher marks than many neighborhood councils would have given you. Let me just see, there were more things, but I just want to make sure. The outreach for this election, we did do joint outreach with our region, with many of the groups in our region, the neighborhood councils in our region, and that was helpful. But our big outreach was the one issue, the RFA issue. So different elections are going to have different people come to them accordingly, depending what the issues are, I think. But I do want to say that I think this system of neighborhood councils has grown a lot in the last 10 years that is absolutely vital to the functioning of the city and for people to be heard. So I thank you.
Thank you. Our cleanup hitter is Noel Weiss.
I just have a few questions. One, how do BIDs do it? Business Improvement Districts. They run elections. How are their elections run? Well, okay. That's just the question, okay? Number two, obviously we're getting into absentee voting or even online voting. I'd like to see or suggest for your consideration setting up some metrics. Set some deadlines. Say, look, by X date, we want to have online voting. If assuming based upon certain criteria, we want to have, even if you want to try to experiment in, because now you've got regional neighborhood council associations that are just kind of evolving, Harbor, West Side, Valley. Try some experimentation. There are professional election administration outfits. There was one actually from San Diego that came up that made a couple of presentations. Bring them in. I mean, again, obviously you had your outreach, and that was good, but there's still a little, too much talking, to themselves or to each other, and you need it really to get beyond that. The idea, there's a new thing in terms of outreach, patch.com. I don't know whether you've heard of it, but they're basically, Chatsworth Neighborhood Council is getting directly involved with it. It's basically an AOL situation where they're coming in. You know what? This is a natural thing. You have leveraging technology in terms of getting outreach, and I think you can challenge each neighborhood council, maybe even with a contest, and say, you know what? The next election, we're going to incentivize you. We're going to the council with the most outreach gets a prize. Maybe it's an extra few $1,000s. Maybe it's an extra $5,000 for their 45. So instead of 45, it'll be 50 if you produce. Make it, provide some internal incentives so that you can basically get, and then you'll get some leveraging. I think the online situation is, something that the technology, it's happening with an app. I mean, I'm not, my technological aptitude is below zero, but there are people who can. And I think if you challenge neighborhood councils this way, you know what? I think you'll get back basically what you need. The other thing is, in terms of city attorney, look, if it was my attorney, I think they're doing a lousy job. They need, for them to say, oh, look, we had a problem, we had this grievance, we had that grievance, without describing it, you know what? Let them come up with alternative definitions of stakeholder consistent with the input basically that they have. For them to come out with a letter that's basically bland saying, oh, you know what, there's a problem with this, well, that's not telling us anything. Provide some concrete legal input and advice so that you guys can basically do your job better. So that's kind of the whole thing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And that included your general public comment as well, Mr. Weiss. So
I suppose.
Thank you, thank you.
Actually, no, you know what? If I have just another.
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
Just- You only used 2.5 minutes.
Okay, well, guys, you don't want to
Go
hear
ahead.
Can I say one thing?
No.
It's really important.
It is 10 after 5.
I
It is
agree.
10 after 5.
I agree. I just want to say, just in terms of your follow-up on your town halls, you published some general information, but as far as the blood and guts of what you were able to come out of that,
It's in the works, and it will be absolutely publicly available. We'll include it on our blog, our policy blog, and my website. But we're still there's a lot of volume of stuff, and we're still integrating it in a useful way that's user friendly.
I would just want to propose again a couple of things going forward. Just keep in mind, this is just general public comment. Really, if we can honestly try to follow the charter in terms of budgeting for 2 years in advance as the charter, for the whole thing that the charter really says, I think it would lend a lot of credibility to the process, because part of it is, where's the funding going? It allows planning. It allows them to be able to run a neighborhood council properly without the degree of political influence. The other thing that I want to, again, try to reinvigorate and encourage is these 908 commissions. That's never been done under the charter. I think you have an opportunity to really, again, if you're talking about outreach, what better outreach can there be than if you basically say to neighborhood councils, we can't do it all. We want to have pick an issue. It doesn't matter. They're supposed to be advisory. They can fund it if they want out of their $45,000. But you know what? It is bubbling up from the bottom up, and we have these. Again, these associations. If you can just do that one time, I think you will begin to demonstrate through a little success story. Ooh, the neighborhood councils did this. They had their hearings. They came up with some advice. The city council took the advice. And you know what? It'll make your job easier. I think sharing of power, it's kind of like love. If you give a little more of it, more comes back than what you give. It's the same thing with power. If you just give a little away.
What a lovely note to conclude on. Thank you, Mr. Wise. We are adjourned. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
More power of love.
What's that?
Alrighty, you enjoy your